Hi, I'm Kinsey Sullivan, and my presentation is on Charles Darwin's initial concept of survival of the fittest. So to begin, a little bit about Charles Darwin is that he was a 19th century geologist, biologist, and naturalist, and he was known most commonly for his theory of natural selection, which was also known as the concept of survival of the fittest. And the core idea of Darwin's theory was that a heritable variation of phenotypes is present among individuals, and individuals with traits that are more favorable in their environment have a higher chance of survival. And Darwin developed his theory through knowledge of prior theories, fieldwork, and application of other logic, as you'll see in the following slides. Three of the evolutionary theories preceding Darwin that contributed to his theory were the ideas of Anaximander, Aristotle, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Anaximander was a Greek philosopher, and he initially proposed that life forms from non-life and man evolves from animal. And once that idea became more widespread, Aristotle, who was also a Greek philosopher, added on to it and stated that heredity was involved in acquiring traits with a purpose. And closer to Darwin's time period, in 1809, French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck noticed similarities among creatures and proposed a transmutation of species due to evolution. So on this slide we have the second voyage of the HMS Beagle, and this was accompanied by Charles Darwin from 1831 to 1836, and you can see he went to places such as Australia, Africa, South America, and the Galapagos Islands. Aboard the second voyage of the HMS Beagle was where Darwin gathered most of his research he used to formulate his theories, and two of the places that he found his most significant findings were in Punta Alta and the Galapagos Islands. And in Punta Alta he discovered fossils and bones of an extinct creature similar to a rhinoceros, and in the Galapagos Islands he found differences in tortoise shells and mockingbird beaks among the different islands, and he also noticed how well suited iguanas were for their habitat. And all of these significant findings he recorded in his red notebook. So the formulation of Darwin's evolutionary theory was ultimately composed of three different parts, and the first part was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of transmutation of species. And Lamarck's theory suggested that an inheritance of acquired traits is a factor of evolution, and that species have the capability of altering themselves completely. And Darwin agreed with this concept, but he disagreed with Lamarck's straight path from simple to complex form. And the second component that Darwin called upon to formulate his evolutionary theory was Malthusian logic. And Malthusian logic is the idea that population growth is exponential while food supply is limited. And Darwin determined that this struggle for existence had to result in some sort of changing effect among species. And he observed this in the observations he recorded in his red notebook while out doing his fieldwork. And these observations led him to believe that species underwent change over time based on their environment. And so with the formulation of Darwin's theory, he published a joint paper in 1858. So the main concepts in Darwin's theory of natural selection were variation, heritability, competition, and differential survival. And variation refers to the idea that there's a wide variability of species, and from this, Darwin determined that some populations show more variability, such as ones that are geographically isolated. The second component was heritability, and this refers to the idea that traits are passed down from parent to offspring with environmental factors in mind. And Darwin formulated from this that genetics work to separate traits based on practicality. The third component in Darwin's theory was competition, and this is the idea that local species must compete for survival. And with this, Darwin suggested that an increasing mortality rate will appear within a species that isn't as strong as a different species. And lastly, with all of these together, Darwin formulated the idea of differential survival, which is the idea that species will survive will pass down traits that are complementary with survival. And Darwin called this process of differential survival natural selection, hence his theory of natural selection. And included in his theory, Darwin also added some genetic science to back up his ideas, and this genetic science was ultimately the thought that genotypes, which are an organism's genetic biology, determine phenotypes, which are the physical characteristics. And Darwin proposed 3 different types of selection that occur, and these different types are directional, purifying, and stabilizing. And in directional selection, the frequency of alleles associated with a favorable trait are increased, and this can continue until a trait is fixed among an entire population. The second type is purifying or disruptive selection, and this is the removal of alleles that are unfavorable. And our genetics do this because they want traits to become less common that decrease survival. The third type is stabilizing selection, and this is the most common form of selection, which uses directional and purifying selection to determine intermediate variations and favor them. So as a result, the most common traits are non-extreme. So following the publication of his joint paper in 1858, Darwin's theory was not very common. And when he published On the Origin of Species in 1859 was when Darwin's theory really became more widespread. And ultimately, Darwinism became a branch of evolutionary research. This was my presentation on Charles Darwin's initial concept of the survival of the fittest. Thank you.